So we've been talking about studying women of the Bible for several months now, and I quite honestly have been sort of pushing Sarah off because I don't always know what to do with Sarah. So maybe you guys will have some interesting comments as we talk about Sarah, Abraham's wife. And not this Sarah. And we're going to talk about you, but since you came, we can't talk about you. I sometimes don't really know what to do with Sarah, and so let's sort of get into that. Talk about Sarah a little bit. Let me just give you an outline of Sarah's life to start with, just so you're kind of reminded of some of the incidents, some of the experiences she had. She went with her husband, Abraham, and their family when he left Ur, where apparently they were settled urbanites, and went off into this country that they didn't know, that God promised to show them, a God that Abraham knew to some degree, but that, Sarah, we're not told Sarah had these experiences with God. So, maybe it was only through her husband that she was hearing about this God that had promised to make them a great nation and give them a land. And, I can't imagine what that must have been like to just follow him as he pursued this. She was childless, which was in her culture, her society, a mark of shame, something to be ashamed of, something to be despondent over. There was no future for their family, no future for her, and it was just a shattering experience to be infertile, to not have children, and so she is childless, but she's promised that in her old age, God is going to give her a child. She laughed at it. She did laugh. We're going to talk about that, son. She laughed at me. Well, wouldn't you? I mean, I sometimes we look down on Sarah a little bit for that, but I mean, come on, it's ludicrous. It's hilarious. It's so. And I love the Hebrew figure of speech. It was no longer with Sarah as it is with women, or something like that is the phrase they use. But it was, it basically meant she's done with it. There's no hope, and so yeah, she laughs at this whole notion.
Abraham laughed, but somehow we remember Sarah.
Abraham laughed as well. He did. The first time Abraham heard it, he laughed too.
Good. I don't know, comedy period.
Yeah. I mean, it was a belly laugh to think of that. So as things went on, as the promise went unfulfilled, you will recall she gave her servant girl Hagar to her husband to become another wife and a surrogate mother, through which she hoped to build her family. That's the way she puts it. She two times when kings in different regions took a liking to Sarah, Abraham said, tell them you're my sister, because Abraham's looking to cover himself, and he's afraid he's going to be killed if and somebody's going to take Sarah for their own if they know that he's her husband. And so twice Abraham comes up with this plan. It's only a halfway lie because they are related, but it leaves out a pretty important thing that both these kings discover when God curses them, basically because of the relationship. And they come back to Abraham and say, "Why didn't you tell us?" Isaac is finally born. When Isaac is born, she sends Hagar and her son Ishmael away, or has Abraham send them away. Don't want them around anymore, which seems pretty heartless. Um, we're not told what her frame of mind is, but at some point, Abraham takes Isaac up on a mountain to sacrifice him because, quote, God told him to. The only thing I can figure about that is that she had no idea. She didn't know where they were going, what they were going to do. Abraham had faith, I suppose, that God was going to provide a sacrifice, and he did. Top it all off, Sarah is buried in a cave at the end of her life. That's where she winds up, in a cave there that is the only property Abraham ever owns in the promised land. That's a rough thumbnail sketch. There's other stuff, of course, that happens to Sarah, but that's sort of, for our purposes, enough to get it started, maybe. From my perspective, the biblical record on Sarah is a little mixed. However, Sarah does get mentioned in Hebrews 11 as a person who, from whom we can learn about faith. And so, I mean, there's something there, right? That the writer of Hebrews, at least, felt that Sarah had a measure of faith that we could learn from. So let's talk about Sarah, and let's see what we get. Any thoughts to begin? Just let me throw it open. Maybe you read some or all of the text that I suggested you take a look at today. Any thoughts whatsoever on Sarah? Just anything on your mind?
I think a big part of her faith was in her husband. She called him Lord.
Okay.
So you don't hear that in the Bible very much.
Peter,
Kind of like we call Jesus Lord.
Peter talks about the honor, the respect that she showed to Abraham. Yeah,
Shows a lot of faith there. She went all over the place with him.
it says in that same text that she did not give way to fear, which is interesting. She didn't give way to fear. I don't really know for sure what the fear that is being talked about there is. Maybe fear that he's going to lead her astray. Maybe I don't know, but she instead of showing fear, she maintains the respect that Peter kind of looks at as a model for Christian women in his era. And again, the writer of Hebrews, faith. She had this faith. What else? Other thoughts?
The question that comes to mind is, where do they get that from?
Where do they get what from?
Sarah's faith. I mean, perhaps she had some, but it's kind of unfortunate that when she does act, it doesn't come off very well in scripture.
Okay.
She doubts the coming of her son, and she comes off as pretty vindictive and heartless when she interacts with Hagar and Ishmael. We don't have anything else besides that, really.
That's the struggle I have with Sarah a little bit. It's hard to, sometimes it's kind of hard to root for her. Now, I will say this. Sarah had a rough time. Sarah went through a lot. She had to deal with a lot. And, I just sort of mentioned some of the things she had to deal with as we started here. There's a lot going on in her life.
Patrick?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's right.
Well, most of the things that I'm trying to think of the parallels. Most of the things that you've brought up in kind of the, well, what do we think of her? Is she a good or bad or whatever? I mean, you didn't use it that terms, but most of the things we're faulting her for, Abraham had parallel things to fault for. So I'm not sure why she's any different from Abraham, which we don't have any trouble saying was a man of God. I mean, I'm not excusing it, but she laughed, but so did he.
Yeah.
She sent Hagar in because she wanted a child and then had a change of heart. But who did Abraham wasn't, I mean, he had a voice in this too, so to speak. I mean, he was troubled by the fact that they weren't getting along, but he was partly responsible for, I mean, I'm not understanding a little bit that, I mean, he sent her in to pretend to be his sister for his own protection.
Yeah.
And she ended up being taken I mean, that's appalling by our sensibility today. And Abram's like, yeah, I got to protect myself. I mean, it,
Yeah.
I see parallel criticisms, and I don't know why she gets more of it than that. I mean, we know less about her, I suppose. We don't have.
I think that's it. I mean, the things that are mentioned about her specifically that she does, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, as I said, there was a lot she's dealing with, and a lot of it came her way because of her husband, or because God told. I mean, you know, her perspective would have been, my husband is telling me to follow him to to the promised land, to leave my home. You know, that's what he's telling me to do. Yeah, that's rough. That's a tough thing to get into. Being given up to these foreign kings because Abraham's a little worried that somebody's going to try to take him out on her behalf. I mean, yeah, I think you're right, and that's one of the reasons I should have said I struggle with what to do with Sarah, because while there's some stuff that happens that, you know, you can't exactly be in her corner rooting for her, you certainly do understand why she does the things she does, and I that's one of the things I want to sort of get around to and to talk about a little bit. Other thoughts?
Yeah, we have some good told about Abraham to balance out all the mistakes he makes. If we didn't have any of that stuff, he'd come out looking more like Jacob.
Okay, yeah, we do have more about Abraham. Yeah, and a lot of it very positive. Abraham painted often in glowing terms in the Old Testament, obviously, because of who he was and because of his role in the history of Israel. One of the things that I have always liked about Genesis is it does not paper over the character flaws and the people there, though they're painted in often like legendary terms, they seem like real people because they make the same mistakes we make, and they often, you know, just goof it up as badly as you could goof it up, and yet God still is working with it. And Sarah is part of that. You know, good, bad, indifferent. Sarah is part of that line. Yeah. Colette, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think I like this part about Sarah. It says, then Sarah said to Abram in verse 5 of the first couple of verses, you're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my servant in your hand, on and on. But you can look at this both ways, that she's being kind of complaining, but I like the strength of character and the moxie. I don't know, just saying it's your fault. She just didn't move over and take to her suggestion because he did it. Like I said, you can see it both ways, but I like the fact that she spoke what she felt. Right or wrong, she was upfront. She said, you could have stopped this, but just because I gave it to you, I gave my maidservant to you, you didn't have to do it. And I like that about her. I like that she spoke up about it versus being quiet and submissive to her thought of that being okay. She had something to say about it, and that's always good.
Let's read in Genesis 16. That's a good point. Let's read in Genesis 16. That was the first text I wanted to look at. So let's read in Genesis 16. This is the story of Hagar, Sarah and Hagar. Now at this point in time, she's still Sarai. However you want to say it, it doesn't matter. We won't get it right anyway. So Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed. Sarai had said. And so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, and I think it's interesting that time reference, right? It's 10 years since we did what God said and came here, and we still got no children, and we're not getting any younger. He slept with Hagar, she conceived, and when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And Sarai said to Abraham, Abram, you're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. I'm not sure she is saying as much, you shouldn't have done it, though maybe she is. I think she's definitely saying, you could stop this. You could do something about her treating me with contempt. That's what she's getting at. Now, for us, we kind of go, well, Sarah, princess, what's your problem? Just relax, just chill out a little bit. But I mean, a couple of things. Again, she's feeling that shame of not having her own children. And I mean, this is a slave relationship. Now, we are repulsed by that whole notion, and rightly so. In their culture, that was not something they were repulsed by. And what Hagar was doing was a pretty serious thing in treating her mistress in this way. So while I have no sympathy whatsoever, at least you have to sort of see how in their world this was a major breach. What Hagar is basically doing is saying, I'm the primary wife now because I have the child. And so that's a pretty serious thing. And Sarah responds in probably a pretty predictable way. The fact that she comes up with this idea, sometimes I hear people really criticize her for the fact that she comes up with this notion, this plan, which again, I understand, but what she does is actually well within the bounds of what her culture expected. And probably would have been surprised if she had not tried this. I mean, this is what you did. This is the way it worked. Think about Jacob later.
And say she's not the only woman who did that.
No,
because Leah
and Rachel
gave her maid to Jacob when he stopped coming to her, I guess. And then who was the other wife? Rachel gave her maid because she wasn't getting pregnant.
I mean,
so
this is what you did. This is the way it worked. And this is none of this is unusual, out of bounds in their culture. It seemed weird to us. We look at it and just kind of, but just understand that what she does is absolutely within bounds in our world.
But it still backfired.
Well, it does. I mean, it does.
It works.
I think the real problem is they think they have to make up for God's mistake.
That's
Acting fast enough.
That's the problem.
She's a man, and so is Abraham.
Yeah.
They're both at fault.
Yeah, that's the issue, I think. That they did not wait. Now, what they're not necessarily writing God off, but they're sort of saying, hey, maybe this is what God meant. Maybe this is how this is going to happen. I mean, that's a very human thing, right? Yeah, let's help God out a little bit here. Let's sort of move things along so that God's will can be done. Colette, did you have a point?
Yeah, it just seems like what you said about our culture, it doesn't make sense to us, but it didn't make sense to them on some level too, spiritually speaking about things, like you said, let's speed this up. Let's figure out if we can get to the same ending, going about it a different way.
Maybe
I don't
this-
know.
I mean,
I don't know. I still just think Jesus came from one crazy family. I mean,
I agree.
it's just, I mean, you're never going to look at the patriarchs as a model of Christian home life. I mean, it's just bizarre.
But isn't that a little comforting that Jesus came from a crazy family too? I mean, that's kind of comforting. It is for me.
Hey, watch it there.
It's like one of Christy's relatives who used to tell people, well, at least I never murdered somebody. Okay.
That's your bar. Hey, more power to you. So yeah, I mean, it is. It's, and that's again what I like about Genesis. There's this constant chaos that just sort of drives the story along, and it's like God herding cats, right? It's like trying to get everybody sort of lined up and where they're supposed to be, and they won't, they won't have it.
So in verse 1, it says she owned the slave.
Yes,
So is that literally she owned the slave, or it says she, it doesn't say they, it doesn't say Abram.
at least she
Yeah, it doesn't.
served Sarah particularly, I think is what's definitely. Now, I don't know how ownership would have been done. But probably if she owned Hagar, it was because Abraham gave Hagar to her in some way. Or she acquired, they were in Egypt, so maybe she acquired Hagar
I just
in Egypt.
wonder if she was her slave, Sarah's slave, why does she get mad at Abram whenever she's treating her with contempt? I mean, I'm thinking, she's your slave, you take care of it.
I think because it says in verse 3, Sarah gave her to her husband to be his wife.
Oh, I see.
So I believe what Sarah understands is that, now you're responsible. Now you,
Yeah, that makes sense.
now you're responsible for this. She's a second wife in some way. And she, I believe, feels that she's the primary wife after she
Right.
conceives. So Abram says what you say, Sarah. Your slave is in your hands. Abram says, you take care of it, passing the buck along. Abram seems to be pretty good at that sometimes. He's pretty good at letting other people take care of things for him. And,
Delegating.
yeah, delegating. That's a nice way to say it. So he delegates this out to Sarah to deal with. And Sarah mistreated Hagar and she fled from him. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert and says, where have you come from? Where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much, they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you're now pregnant and you'll give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he'll live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I've now seen the one who sees me. So Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son he had born. Abram was 86 when Ishmael was born. So God sends her back, which is interesting and maybe a tad troubling too, and sends her back with the mandate. What is the mandate she is sent back with? Submit to it,
That suggests that they both were kind of responsible for the cat fighting.
Well, I think that Hagar is seen to bear some responsibility in this. Now, again, in my way of thinking, I kind of look at that and I go, right on, Hagar. You go, you tell that woman what you think are. But that's not the way it seems to be regarded. And she is now. God hasn't forgotten her, and God doesn't think she's worthless. And God sees her work. God sees her, and that's what she says. I know God sees me. He's not just Abram's God, right? He sees me too. And so, but go back and submit, which is maybe hard for us to
Well,
do.
if your theory is right, that the anger with Abraham is because from Hagar is because Abraham's allowing her to look on her with contempt versus correcting that. The angel of the Lord, while he sends her back, also does what Hagar was asking Abraham to do. Because he says, you go back and be there, but you be in submission to her, not taunting her, if you will.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's accurate, but I find that interesting. If that is the scenario that the angel does, that doesn't say go back and taunt it. It says go back and act proper in the situation.
I think that's reasonable. I think that's a reasonable way to read this. Again, I think the struggle we have is what do we think of this? I mean, the culture realities are fine, but I think the lack of, what we kind of perceive as a lack of faith is what stands out to me here. If you then look ahead into Genesis 17, scroll down, or turn, whatever you're doing.
Patrick, before you go on, can you?
Oh, yeah.
I guess I'm struck when you said it's a lack of faith. Can you expound on that more? Because
Well,
I think it's what someone said with you, I forget who said it, is that we're not doing it the way God would have us to do it, therefore there's the conflict. But in our error, is there still faith? And I think that's why I want you to, because I mess up all the time, but I don't think it's because of a lack of faith. I don't know, just if you would say more.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I mess up because of a lack of faith, for sure. Maybe that's too easy to say, a lack of faith. Maybe it's
Belief and my commitment to God when I say my faith.
But I think this thing goes off the rails. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? It's one of those things where we look at it and we go, well, it didn't have to happen. Maybe it shouldn't have happened, but of course, then Ishmael isn't even born. And so, I don't think Hagar would have regretted that it happened. I don't think Hagar would have regretted that all this had gone on. So the lack of faith I had in mind is God says, I'm going to give you a child. And time passes and Sarah seems to take matters into her own hands, and Abraham. I'm sort of thinking of that or talking about that as they sort of ran out of faith. At least in that moment.
They're called weak faith.
Now that's not once and for all, right? That's not they quit believing at all. We're not really told anything at all about Sarah's theology, about her belief in God that I saw. We're not really told much at all about
That shows Abraham had a little weak faith to go along with the plan.
it. But Abraham was the one who was receiving the communication, and he says, yeah, maybe you're right. I don't know.
We probably misconstrue what faith really is. It's not something you absolutely have or
Yeah.
absolutely don't. It's situational, it ebbs and flows, and this is definitely an ebb for both of them.
And
Later on the mountain, we see it perhaps at its peak with Abraham. I'm sure Sarah had too. I mean, all of us are.
I've made mistakes like that where I just, and in the moment, I just kind of ran out of faith, or I forgot something. Or I lost sight of God's faithfulness, or something along those lines. And I lost sight of the fact that God's faithfulness has something to do with my life and my present. And I think that's a very human thing. So that's kind of what I meant, Colette. I hope that sort of helps. I don't mean it in the sense of, she just left God altogether to whatever degree she was there. Just that she lost sight of the promise, perhaps. And they both did.
Yeah, reverting to something Christy said, it's Abraham too, but if Hebrews refers to Sarah as a person of faith, we don't have to actually necessarily even zero in on the passages that specifically are talking about what Sarah did. The fact is, Sarah apparently leaves with Abraham and then goes up to Haran and then leaves all her relatives. And as far as we know, she never sees them again in her life. And she follows this crazy man out into the desert, and they're wealthy. But everything that Abraham, it's like Ginger Rogers, she did everything that Fred Astaire did backwards, right? In high heels, right? And Sarah is she's there all the time in support and sometimes in a starring role. But that's the other thing then. Sometimes when the Bible's telling a story, especially if it's a true story, a character is just there because the character was there. I mean, it's not that it's not a parable here, right? Every vintage, everything, these are not necessarily vignettes from which we always are expected to derive some kind of meaning. Sometimes this is just what happened. And I don't think the writer is expecting us to say, oh, Sarah justifies somehow Sarah's saintliness, or even find that Sarah was wrong. It's just, and oftentimes it's just a narrative function to help, you need another character there to explain, or Abraham to talk to, or things to explain, because she was just part of the story. So we don't have to come to judgment on every interaction here, because sometimes the interaction there is not really there for us to come to judgment. It's just to tell the story.
Right, and I certainly in Genesis, and certainly in the Abraham cycle of stories, it's God's promise that is center stage, right? It's not really, the characters are there, the people are there. I say characters like, but the people are there, but it's God's promise that is center stage, and it's God's promise that is supposed to be the sort of formative thing in their lives. And you see that as you go down in chapter 17, after all this has happened, God comes back to Abram and he says, he names Abram Abraham, renames him Abraham. You've got to keep my covenant, he says. Circumcision is chief among the signs of that covenant. As for Sarai, your wife, you're no longer called Sarai, her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. So it's like, almost like God says, okay, let me clarify. Here's what I meant. Here's what I wanted you to understand. I will give you a son by her, by Sarah. And Abraham fell face down and he laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Abraham is still trying to say, look, we got this perfectly good kid here. Why don't we just make that be the fulfillment of the promise? I'm going to feel a lot better about that, because that's happened already, right? I mean, I feel that way sometimes. You hold on to the things that you already have, right? To let go of that and obey God can be a challenging thing, and believe God can be a challenging thing. God said, yes, but your wife Sarah, yes, he will live under my blessing, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. Yes, he laughs, which becomes important. I'll establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after. As for Ishmael, I'll surely bless him, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. As specific as I can be now for you, Abraham. the son will come through Sarah, and it will be by this time next year, and that's the one that I will establish the covenant through. It's a nice touch too, that God says, as Abraham is drying the tears away from his eyes from laughing, Abraham says, when your son's born, call him, he laughs. I like that. So then chapter 18, I wanted to look at, and this is the story, of course, of the three visitors that in some way represent the Lord, represent God. And they come to Abraham. He and Sarah show them extravagant hospitality, a calf for three visitors. That's a lot of meat, man. That's a lot of beef.
Yeah, but
What's that?
oh, sorry.
Okay, so verse 10, one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now, Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind it. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? I think it's funny. Peter says she called Abraham her Lord. I wonder if he's talking about this passage where, you know, my Lord is old. It's not exactly a flattering statement. He's over the hill and so am I. And, you know, and then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I'll return to you at the appointed time next year and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yeah, you did. You know it. So, yeah, so again, this is the reiteration of this promise that God is making over and over again. You're gonna have this child. You're gonna have this child. I'm gonna seal the covenant through this child that you're bringing into the world. Sarah, you're gonna have this child. Now, next year, you're gonna have a child. And the laughter all around as they do. Comments, thoughts?
I can't blame them. I mean, you have to wait. Can you imagine if we were asked to wait 10 years for anything?
Yeah.
I mean, we wouldn't be able to do it, right?
The laughter to me, I mean, it seems very human. She's not, you know, she doesn't seem bitter. She doesn't seem angry. She just thinks it's ridiculous. Which I don't know that any of us would be that different if we heard something like this. It's, you know, it's, you know, it just boggles the mind to think of something like this. And the laughter, it seems, I mean, it doesn't seem like, it seems good natured, right? I guess what I'm trying to say. I think she definitely doesn't believe, but it's not like, but I mean, that's a problem that she doesn't believe. And I guess that's the issue that we're supposed to see.
We don't have to make excuses for it.
Yeah.
She's a person of faith anyway.
Yeah.
There is though in this,
But
there is though in this passage, as you point out, laughter is a recurring theme.
Yep.
Here. I mean, when she does give birth, she laughs. And Isaac gets a name, right? That means laughter, I think. I'm sorry, he laughs.
he laughs.
Which is a lot better than the names of like Jacob and what it means. I mean, but actually, it is easy to overlook that. But when you think about it in Christian terms, this is the fulfillment of a long-awaited promise. Transition over to Matthew and Luke with the birth of Jesus and the angels saying rejoice, and Christmas being a happy holiday. Maybe there's some parallelism there. Maybe we're supposed to see that. I mean, it's right, the first sign that the promise is going to be fulfilled, and there's some celebration associated with that. There's, I don't know, maybe I'm pushing it too far, but
No.
It seems like that laughter, it's too much there to be an accident. It's intended that we're supposed to take note of that.
It's definitely, and you look then at Genesis 21, which is the text I want us to end on tonight. You look at Genesis 21 when Isaac is born. The Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised. Abraham gave the name Isaac, laughs, to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with him. I like that a lot. God has made me laugh, and everybody that hears about this is going to laugh too. This is hilarious. This is a riot. This is, and it's that celebration. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And I guess that's maybe the point of the laughter that, Abraham laughs, Sarah laughs. When he's born, you be sure you name him, he laughs. And when he's born and Sarah laughs, the laughter has changed, right? It's no longer now, I can't believe this. It's now, I can't believe this. This is amazing. This is stunning. This is, as you say, Ron, this is cause for celebration. And God does that. And maybe that's what maybe if we're supposed to take something away from all these crazy people doing these crazy things, maybe what we take away is God's faithfulness, and that God changes that laughter over time from the laughter of disbelief to the laughter of celebration.
And in the passage, go ahead, Dylan.
That's the interesting question. Hebrews said she judged him faithful, which it promised. And when does that happen?
Yeah.
When signs are unmistakable or sometime before. But that's the way that we are. Sometimes signs have to be unmistakable. That's the Lord. I prayed for that. And now the Lord is doing it. And, we didn't think about it before.
And I think that's a really good point, that maybe if we get there, the point is we got there, not how long it took us, not how many times God had to hit us over the head first. The point is we got there. And she gets there. She gets there to where she realizes God is faithful.
And in the passage you read, it says the Lord was gracious to her. So, I mean, we seem to be struggling with whether or not Abraham was a person of faith or not, or Sarah was how was her faith? But the passage seems to suggest the faith wasn't actually key to the promise. I mean, a promise was made. And if it's grace in terms of New Testament, I know I'm bringing in a Greek word, but if the concepts are equivalent, it is still unmerited favor. And no matter how faithful Abraham was, the promise is still something that no one deserved. Right. It's God being faithful to himself, and to what he's done. And that has a lesson for us as well. Maybe we shouldn't be. Maybe we should just take comfort in the fact that Sarah did have her problems and Abraham did have his problems, and we want to make them better, so to speak, so they deserve it. But do we really want to? Maybe we want to make them worse, to be more like us, right? And realize that God still is faithful and fulfills what he did. One was said he did.
Right. Comment you want to make?
I was just gonna say, it's been 25 years.
Yeah, right.
And it's 25 years later, God has fulfilled his promise.
Yeah. That's a long time.
It's a long time. And he's been affirming it all along through that time, but
that's a long time.
I laugh at things 25 years ago too.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think it's back in chapter 17, that God's grace does show a willingness to reaffirm his promise. Mm-hmm. And they're just not waiting, but he goes back and says it again. And I think that's pretty incredible, that God is not angry that they lack faith in believing that he's going to do this. But he's like, I like the way you said it. I need to be crystal clear that this is going to happen. And that shows how gracious he is and how he holds to his promises, but a willingness to come and reiterate that when, I lose some of the promises, but to come back and say, hey, wait, this is still gonna happen the way I said it was gonna happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a really good point.
Christy.
Other thoughts?
I think we could safely say that Sarah, over time, came to trust God to do the impossible.
She did.
That's what he did.
She did. Christie, did you have a comment?
You're on mute, Christy. Sorry.
This is not, there's no lesson here, but I find it interesting, the two parallels, of God reminding them about the promise, the one directly to Abraham, and then they all go off and get circumcised, and then following that, the visitors. Obviously, we're not necessarily told the time sequence or anything,
Yeah.
but it's just a curiosity to me, like, did Abraham not share that with Sarah? Like, he believed it enough at that point to get all the guys taken care of, and then she still seems puzzled.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just a curiosity to me. I don't know what I don't know that there's anything to take from that, but.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. It's interesting though, the way, and the different forms that reaffirmation takes throughout this story is interesting to me too. The different ways that God says, this is what's happening. Don't you see it? This is what we're doing.
Well, and the narrative leaves out the scene that I would have liked to have heard about when the three visitors come back. They said, surely, I will return. So apparently there was another visit.
Yeah.
We don't get to hear about that one.
Yeah, that would have been interesting, wouldn't it? Other comments, thoughts?
I think the whole narrative shows that they were in a work of progress, right?
They were
Sarah
working. They
and
were working.
Abraham, they're both making mistakes, but they're always growing in the right direction, and that's why he becomes the father of faith in our Bible. But it's like us, we're the same way.
Yeah, and the covenant was a work in progress, right? It was still being fulfilled. It was God still at work in that even, and the whole thing was something that, yeah, absolutely, it's still in process.
All of faith is a real rogues gallery.
Yeah,
People in there we consider worse than her. Jephthah,
yeah,
Samson.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, and
Go ahead.
also Paul in Galatians has an interesting twist on this too.
Yeah.
The whole Sarah and Hagar thing, which, I think people realize, Paul somehow ends up connecting Sarah probably more to the Gentiles and Hagar to the Jews under the law, which is sort of a little bit of a flip-flop, but but we can, the whole point is that Sarah, along with the Jews who refer to Sarah as Sarah mother, according to Paul, Sarah is also our spiritual mother as well, because she was a free woman.
Maybe at VBS next year we should sing Mother Sarah instead of Father Abraham. Maybe that's not necessary. It doesn't fit. Yeah, it didn't work.
I wouldn't try that.
Doesn't work. And the thing that you see when Abraham is concerned about driving Hagar off, and God says, essentially, don't worry about it. This is the way it's going to be. This is the way this is the way things need to happen. And that's hard to hear, because you want to think, isn't there a way we can all just get along? But God says this is what has to happen. And then Paul later uses that as a way of saying you got to get rid of the slave woman to have the child of covenant, the child of the covenant be, and the child of promise be, take center stage. And he's telling the people in Galatia, you're not getting rid of the slave woman. You're hanging on to her, and you need to be driving her away.
Till later.
Yeah.
If I don't think I'd be as good as Hagar. I'd be like, wait a minute, you told me to go back, and now you're sending me away.
Again, yeah.
Make.
Yeah.
And the lovely scene of happiness is real, but then it's not after, it's not that many years later till they're thinking again about the threat Ishmael is.
And it's interesting too, isn't it, that Hagar winds up being finally sent away because Ishmael was laughing at Isaac. Which sort of turns the whole thing back on its head a little bit. All right, thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate all your thoughts and good to hear from you.
I
I
got
know-
one question.
I know. Go ahead, yeah.
One question. Was Sarah the only woman in the Bible that God changed their name?
Trying to think of another one off the top of my head. Anybody think of another woman that God changed her name?
Usually men.
Yeah, usually in the other times it's been men that I can think of. I can't think of one off the top of my head, Linda.
Okay. Then that makes her the only one.
Yeah, I can't think of one, another one. Now, maybe there is one somewhere tucked in there between.
At the moment. All right. Good night.
Everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Everybody.